first reading is from Isaiah chapter 64. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence, as when fire kindles fresh wood, and the fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, and that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome things that we did not look for, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. From of old no one has heard or perceived by the ear. No eye has seen a God besides you, who acts for those who wait for him. You meet him who joyfully work righteousness, those who remember you in your ways. Behold, you were angry, and we sinned. In our sins we have been a long time and shall be saved. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind take us away. There is no one who calls upon your name, who rouses himself to take hold of you. For you have hidden your face from us, and have made us melt in the hand of our iniquities. But now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. Be not so terribly angry, O Lord, and remember not iniquities forever. Behold, please look, we are all your people. The song is
The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus said, but in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth, the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Concerning the day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard. Keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Recently, the newsfeed started telling me that there were a group of miners who were caught in a cave while trying to dig through the Himalayas. For the past few weeks, the rescuers had done everything in order to reach them, but only a few days ago, the last of the debris was removed and the victims hugged their saviors. All of us can imagine when asked that one of the greatest fears we have is to be buried alive. Old stories abound of people who were thought to be dead, who were actually alive, having bells attached to the coffins so that they could pull, hence the phrase dead ringer. And we can all imagine the uninhibited delight, though, of seeing daylight. Seeing daylight after such trial and tribulation. What's interesting to me about this particular story is the fact that it is still a common occurrence to this day. There is still the danger of a cave-in. The German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke of a similar incident about miners being trapped and rescued about 80 years ago in a sermon for the first Sunday in Advent. He says, and it's worth quoting him at length here, talking about these people, we have come up against a brick wall. We cannot get through it. We stand before it horrified and powerless like miners before an impenetrable stratum of rock, blocking their exit. An element of inexpressible fear seizes us before this wall. We hammer it, strike it, and yet merely a few grains of sand crumble down, while the hard rock remains and refuses to yield. At first, our strength seems to increase with our fear. We want to get through this wall, get out of this prison. We're determined to crash through this wall, even if it means doing so with our own heads. 1,000 times we have struggled against our sin, with every weapon our understanding and will can muster. But the wall remains, as impenetrable as ever, and our meager successes merely mock our despair. Our reading today comes from the so-called apocalyptic literature of the Bible. And this is, of course, the way that many of us think about apocalyptic literature. It is a place where we are trapped in darkness and in danger. So why is it, though, that the church has decided to kick off the church year this way? Why does the beginning of Advent start in despair? Indeed, why does the entire church year start this way? This seemingly depressing message is so out of place with the season, isn't it? For shouldn't this season be about wonder and joy and magic? After all, isn't the world crazy and terrifying enough? Without hearing crazy and terrifying messages in our churches, the supposed oasis of life's constant barrage of craziness? The answer is that the gospel doesn't offer us false hopes for false promises and false problems. Instead, the gospel is about the business of offering us real hope for the problems that you and I face. And it's no use coming to God with false problems while we try and handle our real problems on our own. That path only leads to anxiety. Christmas doesn't cap off a prolonged season of Black Friday deals or stuffing ourselves silly at friends and family houses. Rather, it is an answer to the pleas of God's people. How long until the Messiah comes? How long until he breaks through? How long until our rescuer appears? This is the Advent message. So let us hear Jesus' apocalyptic words, spoken with an apocalyptic hope. First, he acknowledges the real problems and the false hopes. Then he encourages us to be prepared. And finally, he reminds us that God is still God, and that you and I aren't. The acknowledgement of real problems as opposed to false hopes, the encouragement which Christ brings, and the remembrance that God is God, whether or not we as humans acknowledge that, is good news, even if it is a hard lesson. I have a confession. I didn't really appreciate apocalyptic literature until I went away to seminary. I, like many Americans, had been trained to be afraid of it. To hear God's judgment, the so-called apocalyptic no, as the end of the story. The fact is that that is not the last pronouncement. And when we understand that, that will produce in you either the greatest hope you will ever know or a fear beyond all imagining. This little apocalypse is found in the Synoptic Gospels. Those three Gospels, the word synoptic means to see together. And they're written in that way because they see the same story. John's out doing his own thing, and he gets thrown in every once in a while just to spice things up. Here, the Gospels, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21 record the story of Jesus speaking of the end of all things, a time of justice and grace. Here, Jesus enters Jerusalem and begins to tell his disciples what they will need to know about the conclusion of the story. That's an important distinction for us when we read this kind of stuff in the Bible. It's about what we need to know, not what we want to know. It's about what we need to hear, not necessarily about what we want to hear. And it tells us who is in the throne. For the biggest problem we have with apocalyptic literature is the same problem that we have with most of the Bible. We confuse what God will do with what we must do. We attempt to make ourselves the subject of the story of the Bible rather than the objects of God's pursuit. And so at the start of Mark 13, the disciples have been trying to earn brownie points with God, as they usually do, as we so often do. And they've been talking about just how wonderful the human deeds are. Most notably, they note how beautiful the temple is. It's as if they're trying to impress Jesus with all that they have done. As if the earthly temple can compare to the heavenly throne. As if the seat from which Jesus has descended is somehow comparable to this pile of stones. For Jesus responds that even the most magnificent of human creations, this temple complex, of which so many rules and regulations and customs for the people of God held, this temple complex will not be left standing. And so from here, Jesus then begins to reveal the world as it is. I often think about this particular passage. Here, The disciples are trying to do what we do so often with the Advent season. They are trying to pretend that they have it under control, that the world really isn't that bad. But Jesus reminds the disciples of a fact that we try so hard to forget. All of us know that the world is filled with pain and suffering. Pain and suffering for all people. And a unique pain and suffering attends those who confess Jesus as Lord. But at the same time, the world to come is so wonderful that it is beyond our comprehension or imagination. This is what we must profess. Here Jesus says no to the disciples' desire to merit favor with God, and says yes to the disciples' need. Their need to accept God's vision, their need to accept God's plan, their need to accept God's kingdom through the eyes of faith. The comments from those walking beside Jesus mercifully reflect comments you and I might make if we had Jesus walking by our side in the same way. They reflect the desperation that is seen in the stories of those miners who've been caught in the cave-in. They are desperate for the light of heavens, but they can find a way to claw their way out into the radiance of that new day. They can either pretend that they are not in the predicament in which they find themselves. And they can't ignore the fact that they are in desperate need of saving. They cannot escape the reality that the cave has fallen down around them any more than you and I can escape the fact that reality so often falls down around our ears, even in Advent. The good news is this: we will need someone to reach down from above and from the outside to pull us out of the prison in which we find ourselves. And rather than deluding ourselves that our works will earn us God's favor, we should prepare ourselves for the rescue. In Jesus' day, the people busied themselves with performative religion at the temple, or kept to a fastidious legalism. Just as God took no notice of the faux morality of the Pharisees or the religious show of the temple priests, Jesus is unconcerned with works righteousness even today. The people of Jesus' day and the people of today so often live our lives as if we are pretending we are not at the bottom of this abyss, that we do not need to be rescued. This is why Advent starts off with a declaration that you and I must remember where we find ourselves. We must know where we are. And this is why Advent is called the season of waiting. Like a child waiting for Christmas, you and I are waiting for a gift that has been promised. A gift promised to you and I since the fall and the strangeness descended down upon us. We were once workers with a purpose in a garden until the cave-in happened. And now we're just waiting for life to break down the ceiling that separates us from the heavens above. You and I can still busy ourselves and work while we wait, but our salvation will not come from our work or being paid for our work. It will have to come from outside of us. It will have to come down and break through and rescue us where we are. So wait and watch for God's work in the world. But if you're like me, waiting patiently isn't easy. Perhaps it's the hardest part of Jesus' little apocalyptic message. We're so addicted to doing stuff that the command that we wait and accept God's grace freely is the most galling instruction we can imagine. It's one thing to say you must do this to be saved. It's another thing to say someone else has already paid for your salvation. Jesus' words of comfort that God will bring about justice and mercy on his own time bother us because we want to be in control of what we imagine is our own schedule. We want to know when we must begin caring about the kingdom issues like law and gospel, justice and grace. We want to know when we can pencil God in, just as the people of Jerusalem and their temple wanted to know when they needed to stop their religious performance and restart their covenant relationship. Jesus tells them to instead be always ready, to be expecting the unexpected rescuer. Perhaps you've given up believing that you need to be rescued. Or perhaps you've resigned yourself to the abyss that you find yourself in. In either case, this Advent message is for you. God knows you need rescuing, and he knows it more than you know you need rescuing. He sees the real problems. He knows the false hopes that plague your life and plague this world. He tells us to prepare ourselves for a rescue. He reminds us that God has it under control, even while we're busy anxiously worrying that salvation is up to us. So I want to go back to those miners in India and all the miners who have been rescued. But those miners in India, I can't imagine how their families must have felt. Families who had been preparing for the worst, preparing for their holidays without their loved one. Indeed, the entire country felt as if it was holding its breath. And so you can imagine how it felt, not just for those trapped, but for the rescuers when the rubble was cleared and the prisoners were set free. Can you imagine how joyful Christ feels when just one sheep has been rescued? You can imagine how the waiting country finally exhaled and seen those miners, a little worse for wear, but emerging, obviously smiling under the heavens that they thought they would never see again. It's reminiscent of how all the saints must feel when we are finally welcomed home again. And you can imagine those families picking up the phone, maybe expecting to hear the worst news they can even imagine, and instead, the voice of a loved one on the other line saying, "All is well. We're finally here. We're coming home." This is what Advent is pointing us towards. Through the rescue mission of Jesus Christ, those of us who have been trapped in the rubble of this life have been set free. And we will one day be welcomed by our loved ones, and more importantly, by our rescuer at the end of all things. And that's why apocalyptic literature is so beautiful, because the story has a happy ending if you want it to. We will not be alone anymore. We will not be prisoners to our fearful predicament. And this is what you and I can proclaim at the beginning of Advent, at the beginning of the church year, at the beginning of your Christian lives, until the day when the rescue is complete. Amen.